Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I welcome you here tonight to the Robb lecture, and also extend a welcome to the guests who are going to listen and see the lecture by video conference in the adjacent lecture theatre, which is a lecture theatre of about this size. So I believe tonight we have the best part of 1,200 of you here to be a part of this lecture event, which is a fantastic achievement for our guests. Well done. The Sir Douglas Robb Lectures are an occasion when the University of Auckland honours the memory of Sir Douglas Robb by bringing to Auckland prominent and interesting speakers who give a series of public events open to all. They are important events for the University, of course, but also for the citizens of Auckland whom we invite to attend these lectures each year, and it is great to see so many of you here from Auckland with us tonight. Some of you will have attended all three of the lectures, and by now introducing both the speakers and the topics may not be necessary, but I would like to just do a brief introduction and to ask you to join me in acknowledging the importance of Sir Douglas Robb in the life of our university and in welcoming members of his family who are able to be in attendance tonight. Sir Douglas Robb, surgeon... thank you. Bit of a delay, I wasn't sure you were going to get the message, but thank you for that. Sir Douglas Robb, surgeon, medical reformer and writer, was a member of the Council of this university from 1938 until 1971 and Chancellor from 1962 until 1968. Robb was regarded by many members of the Auckland medical establishment as a persistent dissenter, but he saw himself as in the forefront of those helping to make New Zealand an enlightened country. A series of public lectures has, over the years, therefore been a fitting memorial to his work and to his life. This year's lecturers, Professor Richard Wilkinson and Professor Kate Pickett, have challenged views about the impact inequality has on society and are very fitting contributors to the Robb Lecture Series. Richard Wilkinson has played a formative role in international research on the social determinants of health and on the societal effects of income inequality. He studied economic history at the London School of Economics before training in epidemiology. He is Professor Emeritus of Social Epidemiology at the University of Nottingham Medical School, Honorary Professor at University College London, and a visiting Professor at the University of York. Kate Pickett is Professor of Epidemiology at the University of York and a National Institute for Health Research career scientist. She studied physical anthropology at Cambridge, nutritional sciences at Cornell, and epidemiology at Berkeley before spending 4 years as an assistant professor at the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on the social determinants of health, particularly the influences of factors including income inequality, social class, neighbourhood context and ethnic density on outcomes such as mortality and morbidity, teenage birth, violent crime, obesity, social mobility and health-related behaviours. In 2009, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett founded the Equality Trust, which seeks to explain the benefits of a more equal society and which campaigns for greater income equality. They have spoken this week on the theme, the human cost of inequality, exploring claims that societies with more equal distributions of income have better health, experience fewer social problems, and are more cohesive than ones where the gap between rich and poor is greater. Their first lecture, Evidence of Damage, presented and examined their own and many other people's research to support this claim about the effects of inequality. Their second lecture, The Causal Processes, looked at how the relation between inequality and social dysfunction goes to the heart of social relations. Tonight they present the final lecture in this series, TheSolutions, which will discuss the ways in which inequality can be reduced in the future. We have, as witnessed by the extraordinary turnout for these three lectures, been very privileged to have speakers of Professor Wilkinson and Professor Pickett's stature address this challenging issue. It's a great pleasure, therefore, to ask you to join with me in welcoming them to deliver the final Robb lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and welcome, all of you. Welcome back, those of you who've been with us on Monday and Wednesday, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. And I'm sorry that we can't welcome and thank you in both English and Maori. You'll have to forgive us. We've been extremely well looked after here in Auckland this week. It's been a real pleasure, and we are grateful to everybody who's made this possible, and to all of you for being willing to join us on this journey, and to all the people we've met elsewhere throughout the week. I'm starting tonight. Richard started the previous two lectures, and it gives me a chance to say something that he's not aware I was planning, and that is to thank him and pay tribute to him for his long decades working alone and often in great isolation on this very challenging topic. These lectures this week, he's really presenting to you the accumulation of a lifetime's work. And it's a major achievement. It's been a privilege to work alongside him for the past few years. And I hope that all those long, lonely years have now turned into something more optimistic, and at this point in his career he can begin to feel that his work is having an impact. When we started to write The Spirit Level, it was because nobody was discussing the impact of inequality, and because we felt, we were sitting on a body of evidence that needed to be shared. 5 years on, the tide has really turned. Inequality has moved up to the forefront of the international agenda. We now have the President of the United States, the Pope, the Director of the International Monetary Fund, and the Secretary General of the United Nations, among many others, discussing inequality, calling it the defining challenge of our time, the root of social evils. And of course, inequality has been moving up the agenda in New Zealand as well, which I suppose is why we're here today. If you're looking at this chart, you can see that from the early 1980s up through around the year 2000, you had a dramatic rise in income inequality, mirroring exactly what was going on in the United States and in the UK and many other countries. Since then, your levels of income inequality have wobbled up and down a bit. We've seen quite a lot of debate in your national press about whether or not income inequality is getting worse or better or staying the same. If we look at a smoothed picture over the past years, you can see that huge rise again through the 1980s, ending around 2000, and really since then, your levels of income inequality haven't changed that much. So your current government can probably claim, yes, that things aren't particularly getting worse in the last couple of years, but your previous government can't really claim that they made things much better either. Really, nobody's done much to unpick or dismantle that massive rise in inequality that you can see on the chart. And talking to people in Auckland this week, many people have told us how much they feel that society has changed. Your levels of health inequality are rising. The two levels here show a rise in inequality in health. The top line is for men, the bottom line for women over time. And so your health inequalities are not diminishing over time, they're increasing. Your quality of life survey shows that levels of trust are falling as well, very indicative of the deterioration in the social fabric and the lack of social cohesion produced by inequality. We know that your levels of imprisonment are going up, that your performance on the international tests of student attainment are falling. I spent some time today looking through all of the charts we have comparing countries' health and social problems to their levels of income inequality. And in every single one, New Zealand is right about where we would expect to find you, given your level of income inequality. You're not an outlier on any particular measure. Your child well-being, your health, your levels of trust, your homicide rates, your imprisonment, your education, they're all about where we would expect. And yet most people in most societies would prefer greater equality. These charts here come from a study that was published by some researchers in America who set up an internet-based survey of people's feelings about inequality. And they were shown two distributions of incomes. On the left is the actual distribution of incomes in the United States, where the richest fifth have 84% of the wealth. And on the right is the distribution as it was at the time in Sweden, where the richest 20% owned 36% of the wealth. And people were asked which distribution of wealth they preferred. They were not told that one was the United States and one was Sweden. 92% of Americans preferred the Swedish distribution of wealth. And that varied hardly at all by whether or not they were Republican versus Democrat, educated versus not, young versus old, men versus women, and of different ethnicities. There was a massive preference for a more equal distribution of wealth than they have. In Britain, we have a social attitude survey conducted every year, and people are asked year after year what they think different groups earn. They're asked to say what they think a chairperson of a large national company might make, and all the way down to what an unskilled manual worker might make, or a shop assistant. They consistently think that the top to bottom ratio is 6 to 1. It's shifted a little over time, but that's really what they think the ratio is. The ratio of what they actually get is close to 17 to 1. And when asked what ratio they would prefer, they go below 6 to 1. 80% of the British public think that income differences are too large. That's an enormous mandate for a change. And yet, we see from an article published in the New Zealand Herald, hence their nice pictures, as well as the rather fuzzy chart. Now, I'm not blaming the New Zealand Herald for the fuzziness. That New Zealand comes bottom of a long list of countries in the proportion of the population that think it's the government's responsibility to reduce income differences between rich and poor. Now, in every country, the proportion who think the government should do something will be a bit lower than the proportion who think that inequalities are too large. But the figure here is quite startling. Only just over 50% of you think it's your government's responsibility to reduce income differences between rich and poor. So what we hope to present to you tonight are a range of solutions. Some of them are for government, some of them are not. Some of them will appeal to the left, some will appeal to people on the right. We hope to provide you with quite a menu of solutions. But the first step towards change is information and knowledge. And so you all being here tonight is part of that national debate on your levels of income inequality and starting to think about what you can do to change them.
Good. We're going to change over several times, so don't bother with clapping each time. I think I should say at this point, I think you've got the changer, Kate, that we've talked about health and social problems in relation to inequality, and now we're going to talk about how we might try and reduce inequality. Many people immediately have worries about the economic implications of that. But I should remind you that for some years there has been lots of empirical research on the connection between equality and economic growth, and the results have been partly mixed, but predominantly suggesting that greater equality is good for growth. Most recently, the IMF has come out saying that greater equality is better for sustained growth, that inequality leads to bigger booms and slumps. Of course, Christine Lagarde has made important statements about the need for greater equality, as has Nobel Prize-winning economists like Joe Stiglitz and Paul Krugman. I'm not going to deal more with economic arguments, but I think there's no reason to think that reducing inequalities is anything but good for the economy. So, I think that the first thing to point out is there are two quite different approaches to reducing income differences. You can do it through tax and benefits, redistribution of given market incomes, or you can reduce income differences before taxes. In our book, we found that there were countries that adopted both patterns. I mean, Sweden has quite large differences in market incomes before tax, and it closes the gap through high taxation, generous welfare systems. Though actually that picture of Sweden is changing over time. Japan, perhaps rather different, with small income differences before tax and lower taxation. We find similar differences in the United States. Some of the more equal states get their greater equality one way and some the other. It seems to us it doesn't matter very much which way it's done. They both seem to confer the benefits that we've been talking about in these lectures, whichever way you reduce your inequality. The extent to which the tax and benefit system is redistributive varies a great deal. This shows, just for a few countries, how much redistribution is achieved by taxes. The open dots on the left showing that taxation is not progressive in most countries. Taxation itself, including, I can't remember what we call value-added tax, but many of the taxes are not progressive at all, and the overall effect of taxes seems not to be progressive. However, transfers, the benefit system and so on, is much more progressive, but still varies very dramatically from one country to another. You see in Finland, Sweden, Germany, much more progressive than in the United States or Canada, for instance. One of the difficulties of making tax more progressive, of course, is that it's still so easy for the rich to hide their money away. It's not clear how much extra revenue the treasuries would pull in if they raise top tax rates substantially. And they get some more. When in Britain the top tax rates was raised to 50%, they didn't get nearly as much as they expected, but they got some more, but perhaps it's limited to how much beyond that. So before you make the tax system much more progressive, you have to deal with tax havens. I think people don't realize the extraordinary scale of the use of tax havens for tax avoidance. And that $11.5 trillion, that's American dollars, of wealth in offshore tax havens, about a quarter of all global wealth. An absolutely extraordinary situation. And that these tax havens handle as much as half of all world trade and banking assets. And it's really an astonishing situation that we've allowed to occur in our societies. Well, you can read this in 2010, IMF estimated that the balance sheets of small island financial centers, tax havens, added up to 18 trillion, or dollars, about a third of the world's GDP. And, you know, I think people never realize the scale of what goes on in the tax havens. However, progress is being made. Within the last couple of weeks, OECD have got Switzerland and Singapore, and I think a number of other tax havens, to agree to supply information on bank accounts held in those countries to the tax authorities in other countries. That's really important development. Unfortunately, not going to be operative until 2017. And I believe plans are being drawn up for sanctions against non-compliant countries. I can't think why this wasn't done 10, 15 years ago. I think one thing people often feel, a common attitude to taxation, is the money which belongs to people, that they've earned, is almost been stolen from them, that it's legalized theft. But I think that that's really a mistaken view of it. As Warren Buffett says, you know, you can only earn these vast sums if you're in a particular situation, in a society where you have the benefit of high levels of education, of knowledge, of electricity supplies, policing, a good system of law, transport systems, the whole infrastructure. Modern production is a cooperative enterprise. And, you know, he is one of the few people with the honesty, I think, to say that he's been lucky, and to support higher taxation. I want to say something about the things that have really moved income distribution in the long term. This shows you changes in levels of inequality in English-speaking countries from 1920 to 2010. It's the share of income, the whole society's income, going to the richest 1%. And you see, until around sometime in the 1930s, inequalities were high, and then it came tumbling down. Inequalities reduced in all these countries, going on through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then from about 1980 onwards, the modern rise of inequality. And so some of these countries are now back with levels of inequality not seen since the 1920s. And that sense of progress that I grew up with, and I guess most people here grew up with, feeling that class and status and so on, inherited wealth made less difference. You know, now we're recreating the dynasties, families with whose children will not have to work for generations, who've received these huge bonuses and so on, and received them not just for 1 year, but year after year, getting millions of dollars or pounds or whatever. One of the interesting things about these changes, this graph shows for the USA from 1918 to 2008, first the red line on top, which is the share of income going to the top 10%, so rather like the last graph I showed you. But the blue line underneath it shows you what happened to trade union membership. It's very much the inverse of what happened to income distribution. The same thing happened in one country after another. As trade unions strengthened, inequality reduced. As trade unions weakened, inequality widened. These are figures I found for New Zealand, showing a broadly similar pattern. The blue line, the share of income going to the top 1% in New Zealand, and the red line on the right-hand axis, the proportion of the employed population in trade unions. You can also see that pattern over time. This comes from a paper which looks at data for 16 OECD countries in that period from 1966 to 1994, covering the rises in the most dramatic rises in inequality. Each dot there is a country at a particular date. And again, you see that a high proportion of the labor force in population, in trade unions on the right, is associated with lower inequality. I don't think this is an expression of the wonderful things trade unions do for their members. I think it's much more likely that it is serving as a measure, an indicator of the influence of the whole labor movement, of labor parties, social democratic parties, maybe also the fear of communism on policy and income distribution. I remember reading that Roosevelt, when introducing the New Deal, said we must reform in order to preserve, a sense that the system was under threat, you know, in the 1930s. I suspect many people thought that the crash, the depression, was the collapse of communism that Marxism had always predicted. And so I think there was a threat to the system which led to reform. I sometimes wonder whether we should think that maybe communism had been, the fear of communism had been good for capitalism. It allowed it to develop more humanity and develop welfare states and health services and so on. This view, though, that that long-term reduction in income inequality in the 20th century and then the modern rise is due to the sort of strengthening and then the weakening of the countervailing force or countervailing voice of the labor movement, I think is supported rather by a World Bank report that came out in 1993 called the East Asian Miracle. It was about those economies we used to call the tiger economies. Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, which all reduced their income inequality dramatically from about 1960 to sometime in the 80s. And the World Bank has a chapter in this report on why they reduced their inequality. And they said that in each case there was a crisis of legitimacy, that the government faced, again, the claims of communist countries. Taiwan faced mainland China. South Korea faced North Korea. Hong Kong, mainland China. Singapore and the Philippines had guerrilla forces operating. And so, you know, maybe governments reduce inequality when they need to gain public support. And of course, Britain did it in the 2 world wars. And Titmuss, in his essays on war and social policy, says that the government recognized that the social hierarchy had to be reduced in the war to gain popular support for the war effort. So people felt the burden of war was shared. And so, extraordinarily, during the war, despite the bombing and the appalling stresses and so on, we see in the 2 war decades the fastest improvements in life expectancy, British life expectancy in the 20th century. Absolutely bizarre. This is what's been happening, though, to inequality. Inequality has widened in most of these countries because the top incomes have run away from the rest of us. The rich have got rich very fast. This is a paper that, it's American data. It shows the pay difference between CEOs at the top and production workers in the biggest 350 American companies. And you see somewhere in just to the left of the middle, in around 1980, the CEOs were getting, 30 or 40 times as much as the average production worker. But by the first decade in this century, they were getting 2 or 3, occasionally 400 times as much. A 10-fold increase in the differential within large companies. I think that is if you like, an indication of the lack of any democratic constraint on top incomes. I think that the bonus culture needs to be seen like that. A sense that people at the top could do almost anything they like, and each year earning more than most people would earn in a lifetime. I say earn, I've been trying not to use the word earn for those incomes. This gives you a quick picture of the sort of scale of income differences in different settings. We found in the FTSE 100 companies in Britain, the average pay differential top to bottom was about 1 to 300. In the British public sector, however, they're much smaller. Nearly always, if you look at local authorities or health authorities or the police or even the army, differentials tend to be not usually more than 1 to 20 and sometimes as small as 1 to 10. Though I think the movement, the takeoff of top incomes has been moving from the private sector to the beginning to affect the public sector. Even Boris Johnson in the Greater London Assembly was willing to commit them to pay differences of less than 1 to 20. An acceptance, I think, both from our Prime Minister and the Mayor of London, but also the Hutton report. Public sector pay differences shouldn't be more than 1 to 20, and they're usually a good bit less. However, if you look at the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain, I think they employ something like 80,000 people. It's sometimes called the most dynamic sector of the Spanish economy. Pay difference is a tiny fraction of that, 1 to 3, 1 to 9, averaging about 1 to 5. Really quite remarkable. I mentioned the Swiss referendum. They had a referendum on whether pay differences should never be allowed to rise above 1 to 12. That was lost. But 35% of the population accepted it. I think you know what this is about. I think my worry about showing you this is it's such a charming picture. I thought you wouldn't listen to what I was saying, but Kate persuaded me to show it to you. The elephant in the living room is very clearly large businesses, the multinationals, which can run rings round national governments and do so regularly, and governments everywhere trying to lower corporation tax and so on, fearing they'll frighten these companies away. And again, we have to deal with the tax havens, the tax avoidance, and have international agreements in order to deal with that. But I think we must, if you like, rebuild some kind of democratic constraint on people at the top. And I think actually that means extending democracy into the economic sphere. About half the member countries of the European Union have legislation requiring some form of employee representation on company boards. I think often it's very weak legislation that doesn't make much difference, but in a number of countries it's much stronger. Germany, for instance, has different levels of employee representation for different sized companies. But when a company gets to 2,000 employees, half the representatives on the remuneration committee have to be employee representatives. There is now a paper showing that companies with employee representatives on the board, rather like cooperatives, have smaller income differences. I was pleased to see that the CEO of BMW said that none of his executives will have more than 25 times the lowest paid. I think, though, that we have to start thinking in a less short-term way. I at one stage thought I'd show you a picture of my mother sitting on my grandmother's knee. I often try, when talking to students, to try to get people to think in much longer term than the next couple of years. The thing about my mother sitting on my grandmother's knee, my mother's a baby, sitting on her grandmother's knee. Her grandmother was born in 1826, and my mother died just a few years ago. So those two lifetimes in that one picture cover an astonishing period of change. You know, from a time when public executions and slavery and everything flourished to the modern world. And we really have to lift our horizons to think about the long-term changes our societies need to make. And I feel very strongly that the next big part of, or step in human emancipation is to increase democracy in the economic sphere. Reading books on employee buyouts and things like that, I was once going to do some research on employee buyouts, interviewing employees and so on, comparing 10 employee-owned companies with 10 others and so on. I didn't get the money to do the research, but I visited companies that have been through employee buyouts. But people say that an employee buyout turns a company from being a piece of property into a community. It quite changes relationships inside the company. It reduces pay ratios within company, transforms the experience of work. You know, work should be a place where we get some sense of self-worth and value and feel appreciated. Some of us are lucky enough to have that, but many people, of course, just feel used and exploited. I think when we worry about, you know, whether decent benefit systems mean that people become work shy and so on, part of the answer to that is to make work a more attractive experience, so you feel you're valued by colleagues. And if you stay away on sickies and so on, that you're letting friends and colleagues down instead of just getting your own back on someone you feel is exploiting you. So, I think there are many advantages to more democratic frameworks and good evaluations that suggest that actually they improve productivity. I think we can start to think about a long-term growth of the more democratic sector with stronger legislation for employee representation on company boards, government loans for employee buyouts, tax concessions for more democratic businesses. I think we as consumers should be taking our business, our custom, to companies which are either more democratic or have smaller pay differences. And this perhaps rather provocative, this last one, but you know, if just 2% of a company's shares were passed to an employee-controlled trust each year, then employees would be the majority of shareholders in 25 years. And we do know many examples of how these sorts of organizations work, and I think there's a widespread recognition that they're ethically better. It's a better way of doing business. I'm going to say just a few things about more local methods of reducing income differences. An import from the United States to Britain, taken up in a few northern cities, attempts to get the public sector to spend money to do all its purchasing from the local area, particularly the most deprived parts of the local area, and to use their expenditure to support the development of local cooperatives. So colleges, universities, health services, local councils and so on, huge spending power which can be used quite creatively in those sorts of ways. In the UK, about 15 major cities, Manchester, Liverpool, some of the London boroughs, Newcastle, Bristol, Plymouth, have set up, usually the Labour-controlled local governments have set up fairness commissions to report on how income differences can be reduced locally. They have nearly always committed the local authority and some of the rest of the public sector to paying not the minimum wage at the bottom, but at least the living wage. and often asking their suppliers about the scale of income differences, the pay ratios in the companies that supply them. Now those attempts to get companies to pay the living wage are being taken up by a few large private sector employers. There is now a living wage commission, a national living wage commission that Kate is a member of, chaired by the Archbishop of York. And lastly, our Equality Trust is developing a sort of manifesto, trying to get our political parties to sign up to, in the election manifestos, to saying that they commit themselves to reducing inequalities, that they will publish estimates of the impact of their policies and budgets on income distribution, and will also require companies to state what their pay differences are on company reports, and what proportion of their labour force or what numbers they pay below the living wage. I'm going to hand back to Kate now.
Thank you. Richard mentioned earlier that there doesn't appear to be any kind of trade-off between economic growth and economic stability and reducing inequality. We also put up a quote from Barack Obama talking about the great challenge of inequality. Some people are calling it the challenge of the century. I think that might be overstating things a little bit, because I think most of us realize there's another enormous challenge facing our societies, and that is the challenge of climate change and how we are going to adapt our societies to cope with that enormous challenge now and in the future. Luckily, there's a sort of a win-win situation here, as there is with economic performance and greater equality. Greater equality and sustainability go together. They're hand in glove. Importantly, we can reduce CO2 emissions while increasing the real quality of life. But equally importantly, we need to reduce inequality because it increases status competition and so intensifies consumerism. Also, because of the impact of greater equality on social cohesion, levels of trust, collective efficacy, people in more equal societies are more public-spirited and better able to act together for the common good. So I just want to draw your attention to something we talked about in the first lecture, and that is that over time, while gross domestic product has increased in many countries, our well-being has not progressed in the same way. Here we're looking at that gross domestic product rising over time in the USA, and the genuine progress indicator sort of running along the bottom. The genuine progress indicator is a measure of how societies are doing that tends to take out the negative part of GDP and give a more realistic sense of how progress is being made. It's important, I think, to remember that not all indicators of progress are the same. I've come across recently the fact that New Zealand comes top on the social progress indicator, and I would say be cautious about that one. It's been developed in the United States by pro-business interests, I think purely with the intention of moving the US up the international league tables on various things. So America does quite well, Britain does quite well, you do extremely well. But you've seen over the course of this week that actually none of us are doing so great. In the social progress indicator, more weight is given to the number of people who have broadband subscriptions than is given to the rate of deaths from cardiovascular disease. So one does have to be cautious about these different indicators. Remember what we showed you on Monday. As levels of national income per person rise, For poorer countries, the developing and emerging economies, life expectancy rises rapidly, but once you get beyond a certain point of economic growth, you don't see any return to growth in gross national income per person. The same is true of happiness. There's no great benefit to countries getting richer and richer. Once they're beyond a certain point of economic development, the population doesn't get happier and happier. And we've seen this over long periods of time. I believe we might even have had this quote up on Monday, but over 10, 20, 40-year time horizons, there is no relationship between changes in life expectancy and economic growth. So countries show remarkable improvements in health with little or no economic growth. And this is good, because what it tells us is that we can maintain a high quality of life, a high quality of health and well-being without needing relentless economic growth that flies in the face of us being able to create sustainable economies and cope with the challenges of climate change. This chart shows life expectancy once again up the side, but instead of plotting it against gross national income per capita or GDP per capita, it's plotted against carbon dioxide emissions per capita. And the pattern looks almost exactly the same. And so you can see that for the developing and emerging economies, their life expectancy can increase, and we must allow them to emit more carbon. We must allow them to develop to a point where their life expectancy, their health and well-being joins the rest of the world. But for us, we need to contract. We need to reduce our carbon emissions, and we can do that without any loss of quality of life. Because what matters for quality of life, as we've shown you over this week, is the quality of social relations, the way we can interact with one another, the time we have for one another. The reason that inequality is also important for creating more sustainable economies is because inequality drives status anxiety and status competition, it also drives consumerism. It is through money that we express our status to one another. It is through buying stuff. Bet you wish you could afford this stuff. You know, the bigger house, the larger car, the 400 pairs of shoes, etc., that we express our status to one another. And rampant consumerism is a huge problem if we're going to create a sustainable economy. So we need to have ways to rein in consumerism, while at the same time having something to offer in its place, which is better quality of life for all of us. Because inequality drives status competition, because money becomes so much more important, in more unequal societies people work much longer hours, desperate to have that extra income, desperate to keep up. People in the United States work 9 weeks longer per year on average than people in Norway. Think what you could do with all that extra leisure time. And because status is important and money is important, if you haven't actually got it, you go into debt. Household debt has risen with levels of income inequality, all part of this same drive towards consumerism that is such a threat to sustainability. But we talked about the importance of greater equality for social cohesion, collective efficacy, people acting for the common good. In more equal societies, business leaders agree that their governments should give a higher priority to complying with international environmental agreements, another sign that more equal societies are more likely to act for the common good. They're also more equal countries are more generous donors of foreign aid. Norway, Sweden, Denmark and the Netherlands there are the only countries on that chart giving foreign aid to the level expected by the United Nations. other countries falling below that and giving less as they become more unequal. And in more equal societies, people even recycle more. This is an index of recycling of a whole bunch of goods. We could have brought you charts that show that in more equal societies, people consume less meat, ride bicycles more, fly fewer air miles, consume less water, and even that biodiversity is greater in more equal countries throughout the world. So this is a very important issue. So you won't be surprised to see this one. More unequal countries do emit more carbon. And all of the solutions that we've been talking about are as important for us when we come to deal with climate change as they are when we come to think about creating a society in which we all feel we have a better quality of life. Many of you, I know, will have seen Al Gore's film on climate change, An Inconvenient Truth. What we've been trying to present to you over the course of these 3 lectures is a convenient truth. Greater equality is better for all of us. Greater equality is good for our economies, and greater equality is essential if we're going to preserve this world for ourselves and for future generations. And now Rich is going to join me for the last few minutes.
I forgot to make one point when I was talking about the need to extend democracy into the economy, and that is not just the advantages of more economic forms, but that the existing systems of share ownership, share control and so on, has become increasingly anachronistic. Instead of people owning shares in the long term, taking an interest in the company, investing in a few companies they know about, now most shares are handled by financial institutions that buy and sell by computer-triggered programs. The average length of which shares are owned between changing hands is, I think, 4 months. Most share owners don't, of course, go to annual general meetings of companies. And so that system of controlling our companies has become less and less appropriate, given that modern production involves bringing together highly skilled people, highly educated people, and the value of a company is increasingly not its plant and equipment, but the value of the group of people working in it, the assembled skills. I think you can see it's not only the advantages in more democratic forms, but the existing systems are becoming less and less appropriate. This slide, these are people in the prime of life, living in unprecedented luxury, historically unprecedented luxury, full of the joys of spring. It's taken in central London, Oxford Street, just outside Oxford Street Tube Station. I'm showing it to you because it shows how inefficient our societies are producing real well-being, psychosocial well-being. Everyone there is scowling, frowning, depressed, anxious. You know, it's quite an extraordinary picture. And in a way, I mean, we showed you on Monday data that shows in some of our more unequal societies as many as 25% of the population had symptoms of mental illness in the preceding year. You know, these things are not just faces. I think, though, and adding to what Kate said about moving from, about this being a convenient truth, there is one really astonishingly convenient truth that goes with the need to move towards sustainability, and that is that, as she showed you, GNP per capita is no longer producing the real human benefits. It is what's transformed the real quality of our lives, but it's largely, in the rich developed countries, finished its work. Having more and more of everything makes less and less difference. But at the same time, if you look at studies of the determinants of population health in the rich world, or of happiness in the rich world, what those studies emphasize again and again is our social connections. There was a meta-analysis of 150 studies of friendship and health, which showed that whether or not you have friends is more important to survival over a follow-up period than whether or not you smoke. And endless different measures of friendship, the quality of your relationship with your partner, numbers of friends, whether you're involved in community life, all really powerful influences on health. And similarly, studies of happiness, it's all about the quality of relationship, friendship, involvement with others, whether you are involved in community work, whether you do voluntary work, all those kinds of things. So we're moving to a point where well-being is no longer determined or no longer helped by further advances in material standards. The way now we can improve the real quality of our lives is to transform and improve the social environment. And we've been showing you over these lectures that that can be done very substantially by reducing the divisive income inequalities between us. So, we've reached the end of the real benefits of economic growth. Greater equality and the extension of democracy into the economic sphere is now the best way to improve the quality of life. Sustainability is not a belt-tightening exercise, it's that view of sustainability that we all have to make do with less and go on living the same miserable lives, which makes people reject it. There is a much better quality of life available, but it needs fairly fundamental changes in our societies. And we're probably not going to be able to reduce our carbon emissions and move towards sustainability unless we make those more fundamental changes in our social and economic structures. But we can, and this is almost the last slide, transform the relations and community and social relations and community life, transform the experience of work, use productivity gains not just to increase consumerism, but to give us more time for friends, family and community, and raise the quality of life by meeting social needs and through that pathway towards sustainability. Well, if you're interested in trying to do more to increase equality in New Zealand, there are a number of organizations campaigning for that objective. I know very little about them, but these are their names and their web addresses. So I hope you'll think of what you can do to reduce inequalities, improve the quality of the social environment in New Zealand. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Richard and Kate have agreed to take questions for 10 minutes. We have a couple of roving mics. I would ask you to wait until the microphone arrives because you'll be also need to be heard in the adjacent lecture room. And if I could ask you to keep your questions brief and succinct so that they are questions rather than statements that will allow us to use the 10 minutes as effectively as possible. I'm going to start right up the back here.
The respected economist in New Zealand, Brian Easton, has said that the simplest, though expensive, way to reduce inequality is to attack child poverty. Would you care to comment on that?
There are lots of studies which show the long-term damage that child poverty does. But although I think it makes an enormous amount of difference to the children involved to reduce child poverty, and it should be an aim of all our societies, these huge rises in inequality that happened from around 1980 were not primarily triggered by changes in welfare policies towards children. They were an ideological change that came in with Reagan in the United States and Thatcher and neoliberal economic ideas, which went with legislation to weaken trade union powers, lowering top tax rates, and privatization of industries, which almost always meant income differences expanded dramatically in those privatized industries. So I think a number of things that people imagine are important responses, like educational reform, like reducing child poverty, are important in themselves, but they have not been the real drivers of the widening income differences that we're suffering from.
Yeah, I suppose I'd add to that, you know, under the new Labour government that we had prior to our current coalition government, they made substantial progress in reducing child poverty, and it was a major goal for them, and they did make a real difference to a lot of children's lives. And they also reduced pensioner poverty, you know, reduced poverty at older ages. But our overall income inequality didn't really shift over that period because of the runaway top incomes. So although very worthy things were done, our society is just as unequal now as it was before they started doing that.
Kia ora tātou. Professors, tēnā kōrua. My name is Michael Diamond. I have a two-part question. First, the small part. Will you please sign my copy of the spirit level letter? Second, bigger question. On Wednesday evening, Professor Pickett made a connection between inequality and civic participation. As I understood it, the greater the inequality, then the smaller the civic participation or involvement. My question then, is it fair to say that any government that promotes inequality can expect to have lower civic participation in both local and national elections, and may therefore expect to benefit from the growing civic apathy they have generated?
Let's clarify what civic participation is. Have to clarify what civic participation is.
Well, it does include voting. There are a number of studies of composite measures of civic participation. That does involve things like joining associations, belonging to a faith community, reading newspapers, you know, there's a whole range of things, but it does include voting. And there are a number of studies of the relationship between income inequality and voting alone that do show a connection. Your question is rather cynical. And you know, your point may be right, that by allowing inequality to grow, any government that allows inequality to grow is excluding people, and when people are excluded, they do feel politically excluded as well as economically excluded. Whether or not that leads to apathy and therefore them not ever participating, I think remains to be seen. There are other studies that link income inequality to a higher prevalence of rioting and internal social conflict. So I think it would be a very short-term solution to ensuring that you remain in power, and perhaps not the wisest.
I do think that the influence of money in government, in politics in many countries is a really serious problem, and I think that the tendencies are exacerbated by increasing proportion of poorer people not voting. I saw a recent study looking at policy issues where there had been public opinion polls where the incomes of the opinions of the surveyed people were collected. So you could see the opinions of poorer people, middle people, and the rich, and they related the opinions to what the final policy decision was. And overwhelmingly, policy decisions went in the direction that a rich minority would have wanted them to, and not in the way the majority of the population would. That was an American study collecting data over several decades.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. So kind of following on from what you were saying previously, considering you said we should be thinking more long-term about what needs to be done, but our current political systems aren't really designed around long-term decision-making, plus your graph showed that almost 50% of New Zealanders don't actually believe the government is responsible for reducing inequalities. So I was just wondering what role you think the state has for setting a precedent for such initiatives as co-ops and fair wages.
They do already have, many governments have incentives to employee share ownership schemes and some to employee buyouts. But I think you've got to shift public opinion. You've got to campaign for these things. It's not going to happen if you just say, well, that's where public opinion is, there's nothing we can do. It means communication. Information is important. People in most countries, although the majority believe that income differences should be smaller, in Britain it's over 80% who think income differences are smaller. As here, there's a smaller proportion who think that the government should do anything about it. But they think income differences should be smaller, even though they dramatically underestimate how large they are. And one of the things that shifted opinion is that we have begun to hear about the scale of the bonuses and so on.
I think one of the things we need to think about is the balance of what the role of national government should be, the role of local government, the role of communities, and the role of all of us as individuals. We should expect our governments to deliver what the majority of the public want. We should expect them to make policy that benefits the vast majority, the 99%, and not the 1%. We should expect that of our local government as well. But if we look back over this couple of decades of this century and back through the latter half of the 20th century, we see enormous social change, huge changes in the rights of ethnic minorities, huge changes in the position of women, in the way people think about gay rights or other social issues. Massive transformation in those areas. Not completed, but massive change. Those changes didn't come about because any government sat in power and decided to hand over those rights. They came about because we all demanded them. Society changed. We changed the way we thought, and we actually demanded that our politicians follow us rather than the other way around. And I think we hope that in maybe 20 years, less would be nice, it will be as embarrassing to be seen to be greedy and out for yourself and individualistic as it is to be seen now as a racist or homophobic or misogynist.
Hi, why couldn't we just outlaw inheritance? And when you die, it goes to the state and is redistributed in social services.
Why don't we outlaw inheritance?
You could implement it tomorrow.
For those of you who were here on Wednesday, you'll remember the narcissistic inventory that I talked about, and my feeling that the world would be a better place if I was in charge, because I would just do one or two things, and one of those things probably would be to increase inheritance tax dramatically and perhaps to 100%. Say you can't take it with you, you might as well spread it around, which is why I will remain forever in an ivory tower doing research and never be allowed anywhere near a policy-making or legislative body. Do you want to mention Thomas Piketty?
Yes. Two things, though. Many people, of course, do leave their money to philanthropic causes. There are such important charities set up supporting research and all kinds of really important work. So people do this, and they must be encouraged to do it. But Thomas Piketty, I don't know whether his book has had the sort of publicity here, but in the United States and Britain, day after day, there have been whole pages, sometimes several whole pages in our papers about this book. It's been #1 bestseller in Amazon in Britain and the United States, and I think a number of other countries, just called Capital. He's a French economist, and he has reasons for thinking that inequality is likely to continue to grow, unless we take strong measures against it. And the most important measure, he suggests, is a confiscatory wealth tax, international wealth tax.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know you're now going to want to rush home and concern yourselves with what you should do with your inheritances. Just to help you out, I should introduce Mark Bentley, who's head of the Alumni Relations and Development team at the University of Auckland. But seriously, that draws the Robb lectures for 2014 to a close. We've been treated to 3 very challenging, very interesting lectures, and I think probably the largest attendance that we've seen for the Robbs, and that is saying something because the attendances are all very high in recent years, which I think is a reflection of the interest that people have in this subject, but also 2 outstanding speakers. And so can I ask you to join with me for the last time and thank you.